Thank you. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here and introduce Section 2 on making protection goals operational in environmental risk assessments, for which we have two speakers. The first one, and I will introduce her, is Lorraine Maltby. In Denmark, we would say Maltby, from the University of Sheffield in the UK, where she is a professor of environmental biology, and having had an extensive career on freshwater ecology and ecotoxicology, you're now focusing on ecosystems and their impacts with regard to multiple stressors, in particular with regard to ecosystem services. So, Lorraine.
So thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak with you today. And yes, my name is Maltby, so you pronounced it correctly. So what I want to do today is to really carry on from where Alan left off and focus us down on protection goals, and in particular the role that ecosystem services may play in helping us operationalise those protection goals. So we know that we need clear protection goals to have robust and efficient risk assessment. And robust and efficient risk assessment is essential for effective risk management and decision making. And those protection goals need to tell us what we need to protect, where we need to protect it, and over what time we need to protect it. And those protection goals should be developed, as Alan alluded to, as part of the problem formulation stage. Now, legislation gives us some general framework for what those protection goals should be. So, for instance, Regulation 1107 applies to plant protection products, and it states quite clearly that plant protection products should have no unacceptable effects on the environment. It goes on to define what it means by the environment. It means surface waters, groundwaters, air, soil. Not only at the point of use of those products, but also at locations distances away from its use. It also defines which ecological components the statement of no unacceptable effects refers to. Non-target species, biodiversity, ecosystems. But actually, although that seems all-encompassing, the fact that it is so all-encompassing and broad is an issue, because it could be interpreted as meaning we need to protect everything, everywhere, all the time. And we know that's not possible. It's not tenable to do that. There are trade-offs, as we just heard about. There are trade-offs between agriculture and biodiversity. So actually, to make this operational, we need a bit more detail. We need to know, well, what aspects of biodiversity do we need to protect, where, when, and importantly, why? In 2013, a trio of scientific committees produced this report, which is entitled Making Risk Assessment More Relevant for Risk Management. And in that report, they said that risk assessment should relate to the protection goals that are important for management. So again, making this link between assessment and management via protection goals. And they went on to say that criteria such as changes in ecosystem services may be useful for making this link, partly because it facilitates socioeconomic analysis. So, what are ecosystem services? Well, ecosystem services are the benefits people get from nature that enhances their well-being. And agricultural landscapes, such as the one shown in this picture, both provide and depend upon ecosystem services. So one of the most obvious benefits from an agricultural landscape is the crop itself, is the food that's produced. But they also produce other benefits: wild foods, fibre, fuel. They're places we often go for recreation or to be inspired by nature. They play a key role in mitigating our climate by sequestering carbon, alleviating floods, purifying our water, and many other things. These are all benefits we get. These are ecosystem services. But the production in those landscapes also depends on other services such as pollination and pest control. We know that when we undertake agricultural practices, that we can have environmental impact. in the form of habitat loss, contamination by nutrients or pesticides. And these can have adverse effects on the very services that underpin agricultural production, and they're often called ecosystem disservices. So the challenge here is balancing these costs and benefits. How do we manage these landscapes to provide the portfolio of benefits that we desire? And that's the challenge for the risk manager. Let's put a little bit more detail on that and think about how ecosystem services fits in to that weighing up of costs and benefits. Consider this orchard. So the final ecosystem service from this orchard is apple production. And those apples could be consumed as fruit, or they may be converted into some other product, juice, cider, whatever, all of which have a value. But that apple production depends on a number of other ecosystem services: pest control, pollination, nutrient cycling, all of which are underpinned by biological processes. The abundance of natural enemies, the abundance of pollinators, microbial activity. So we go from ecological structure and function through to ecosystem services, and then through ecosystem services to benefits and enhancement of human well-being. That's the causal chain in ecosystem services. Now, a farmer may decide to enhance apple production by applying an insecticide. That insecticide may help control the pest and increase crop production. However, that insecticide may also affect the abundance of natural enemies, affect the abundance of pollinators, affect the activity of microbes, and they may all have negative effects on production. In addition, that insecticide may move off the crop area and contaminate an adjacent water body and have a negative effect on a recreational fishery, which is another ecosystem service. So here we're getting both costs and benefits occurring. The question to the risk manager is, how do they weigh up those costs and benefits? Which set of ecosystem services do they want? What trade-offs are they willing to accept? And in order to help the risk manager make those decisions, we need to provide them with the appropriate information. So if we're going to assess risk within an ecosystem services framework, what does that mean? What do we need to do? Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to know what portfolio of services are required from a particular landscape and by whom. In the previous presentation, Alan alluded to the fact that we want different things from different parts of our landscape. We need to articulate those within that problem formulation. What do we want, from where, and who wants it? Who are the beneficiaries? Then we get onto the ecological questions, which are, what are the components of those ecosystems that provide those services? And what is the relationship between the structure and function of those communities to the provision of the service demanded? What's the relationship between exposure to the regulated product, be it a pesticide, a GMO, whatever, feed additive, and the key attributes of those service providers? And then what are the interactions between ecosystem services? Because you can't have everything everywhere. They do interact. Some of those interactions are positive, are synergies, but many of them are negative. Many of them are trade-offs. Understanding what those interactions are is important. Now, EFSA has begun to think about this, and this work started an opinion they published in 2010 to say, okay, if we were to try and develop more specific protection goals using this ecosystem services framework, how would we go about it and what would it look like? I'm not going to go into details to the approach, I'm just going to give you the outline of it here. I'm happy to talk about details later. But the key steps are shown on this slide. So the first step is thinking about agricultural landscapes and saying which ecosystem services are provided by those landscapes and which of those are potentially affected by pesticide exposure. That begins to frame the area of interest. The next step is for each of those services that are potentially affected by pesticide exposure to identify what are the key ecological components that drive those services, sometimes referred to as service providing units, SPUs. And these can be taxa, individual taxa, or they can be functional groups. Then for each of those key drivers, say, okay, what do we need to protect? What's the entity? Is it the individual? Is it the population? Is it the community? And what are the attributes of those entities that we need to protect? Is it population abundance? Is it individual behaviour? Again, we're narrowing down to making something that we can actually look at within our risk assessment. And importantly, what is the magnitude and scale, both temporal and spatial scale, of impact that would be acceptable in order to protect the service we're interested in? And those are the 5 dimensions that the specific protection goals that EFSA have developed are usually couched in. So a couple of examples. So let's think of a provisioning service, food production by fish in edge of field water bodies. Obviously, fish are the key drivers, the fish that we eat, so particular species of fish. What we're interested in protecting is the abundance of populations of fish, abundance of biomass. But because we eat them, we're also concerned about internal concentrations of toxins. For pollination, we're interested in pollinating insects. Again, we're interested in their abundance, but now also their foraging behaviour. So the population abundance and foraging behaviour are the key attributes there. For some species, such as charismatic species, often pretty birds, mammals, there we're actually interested in protecting individuals. We don't want to see dead birds falling out of the sky or walk past them. So it's individuals that we focus on and their behaviour and their fitness. As from this approach, we can make a number of comments. The first one is that the approach has the aim to maintain a diverse range of ecosystem services at the landscape or watershed level. But it doesn't exclude having short-term effects at a local level. So you can have effects at local level that last for a short time, but you need to maintain the diverse range of services at the larger spatial scale. The ecological entities to be protected are generally populations are higher. The exception to that are charismatic vertebrates. And the assumption is that by protecting populations, you protect species, linking back to biodiversity. But what this approach does is it enables a systematic and transparent assessment of all specific protection goal options. So it opens up that black box. It's asking specifically what do we want to protect, where and when, what are the consequences of this regulated product and what we want to protect, what are the options that the risk manager can choose between. And EFSA have gone on to develop this idea, and there's recently been a public consultation on a guidance for defining protection goals that covers all the regulated products that EFSA is responsible for. Now, it's not just EFSA that's interested in ecosystem services. This is a quote from the EU Biodiversity Strategy, which states that halting the loss of biodiversity and the degradation of ecosystem services in the EU by 2020 and restoring them insofar as feasible while stepping up the EU contribution of averting global biodiversity loss. So, halting the loss of biodiversity and the degradation of ecosystem services by 2020. It's now 2015. It's quite an aspirational target, but that's the direction of travel. But it's not just the EU. Earlier this month, the US administration produced a memorandum that directs federal agencies to factor the value of ecosystem services into all federal planning and decision making. So this focus on ecosystem services and its use in decision making is being driven in a number of areas by a number of bodies. So let's get back to this biodiversity and ecosystem services. Biodiversity often finds the word biodiversity often finds its way into legislation. It's a word we all think we know the meaning of. It's a word the general public think they know the meaning of. But actually, what is it? And how do we measure it? And how do we know we've protected it? Do we mean taxonomic diversity or functional diversity? Do we mean diversity of genes, diversity of species, diversity of habitats? Do we mean diversity of all taxa or just specific groups? It's usually not specified what biodiversity means, and it can mean all of those things. There are basically two schools of thought in thinking about the relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem services. There's what's been coined the ecosystem service perspective, which is the idea that if you manage one, you'll manage the other. So if you manage for ecosystem services, you'll automatically enhance biodiversity. The alternative, sometimes known as a conservation perspective, is that actually there is an intrinsic value to biodiversity. And if you focus on ecosystem services, that will be omitted. And in fact, Georgina Mace, in a paper published in 2012, said actually biodiversity can be many things. It can be a regulator of intermediate ecosystem services, it can be a final ecosystem service, it can be a good. It's important to define what you mean when you're setting your protection goal. So the big question with this always is, if we focus on ecosystem services, will that protect biodiversity? There's a lot written about this, and the literature was brought together recently in a report that was published in May this year, and they used the literature to ask this question: will the use of ecosystem services approach protect biodiversity? And the conclusion they drew was that the answer to that question was likely to be a qualified yes. The qualifiers being that the approach is implemented via policies based on sound evidence and in conjunction with strategies that recognise the intrinsic value of biodiversity. So in Europe, it would be things like the habitats and the birds I read to. So yes, this approach can protect biodiversity, but we need to be very clear and very transparent about what we want to protect, where, when, and why. Now, the title of this conference is about the future of food safety. We need to think about how we manage our food systems and how we manage them going forward with what we heard in the plenary, an increase in global population heading towards 9 billion by 2050. In 2011, the UK government produced this document which is called The Future of Food and Farming, in which they made it very clear that what we had to do was integrate food production with the delivery of other services from those landscapes. And they defined a sustainable food system as one that would not erode the natural capital of agroecosystems, and biodiversity is part of natural capital, would limit the release of substances that may compromise ecosystem services from other habitats, and would prevent the further loss of biodiversity. When we think about these trade-offs between food production and environmental protection, we often just think about them in one way. We think about the regulated product having a potential effect on the environment. Do we approve it? Do we not? And Mark Walpole, in his plenary presentation that started this conference, made a point which I think was a very good point, and that is that environmental risk managers are held to account for decisions they make that go wrong. And that can make them a bit risk averse. And he argued that actually they should be made responsible for all the decisions they make, the consequences of all the decisions they make. For example, it might be desirable to enhance biodiversity in agricultural landscape by reducing the intensity of agriculture. That could be a decision we take. But what are the consequences of that? If by reducing food production locally, it means that we reduce our consumption and our waste of food, then actually the environmental consequences may be neutral or even beneficial, positive. But if that reduction in production is compensated for by an increase in either the imports of food or the way we currently export food, then there may be environmental consequences that are negative elsewhere. We may be importing the benefits, i.e. the food, and exporting the environmental damage. And this is, I'll just finish with this figure, which is a figure of where the EU imports food from. This was from 2013. And most of that food is being imported from developing countries. The United States are one of these, and I'll leave up to the next speaker to say whether the United States is a developing country or not. But in 2013, most of our food imported was from Brazil. What's the global biodiversity consequence of enhancing local biodiversity in a heavily managed, highly regulated European landscape against converting pristine rainforests to agricultural land? We don't consider that in our risk assessment. I think it's something we should do. That's the spatial disconnect between risks and benefits that Mark Walpole was referring to. So in conclusion, protection goals need to say what to protect, where, and for how long. General protection goals based on biodiversity are not operational because there's no qualification of acceptable risk and effect, and they can be boiled down to meaning everything everywhere. There is an inherent trade-off between agriculture and biodiversity, and we need to think about that and manage in that context. And setting specific protection goals within an ecosystem service concept provides a way of doing that. It makes trade-offs in multifunctional landscapes transparent, provides a mechanism for protecting species diversity. It enables socio-economic assessments, thereby making risk assessment more relevant for risk management, and it provides a framework for assessing spatial disconnects and the environmental consequences of the global food trade. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lorraine. You and Alan are making our helmet and my job quite easy today. We have some time for one or two questions, so anyone? Yes, here at the front. Put your hand up. Yeah.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Martin Dermine. I work for the NGO Pesticide Action Network Europe. One thing that appeared in the two first presentations is that you have to oppose agriculture and feeding the world with the environment. I think we also talked a lot on innovation in the last days, and I think that it's not so clear, black and white, agriculture versus biodiversity. There are many examples of farmers. For instance, in the north of France, there's a big group of farmers who reduced by 50% the use of pesticides, keeping with the monoculture system, the conventional agricultural system, by using all the knowledge we now have on agronomy without reducing the yields. So it's not so black and white. And there are also many studies showing that different models of agriculture are as or more productive as conventional agriculture without using chemicals, but it requires more people working in the field, but have high yields with using agroecology. So I think it's also important. I agree with you, it's important to take all aspects into account in the risk assessment, also feeding the populations, but also thinking not only on one model of agriculture and also the diversity that also exists in the scientific peer-reviewed literature. Thank you.
Okay, I'll quickly comment to that. You're right, there are different ways of doing agriculture, but if you convert a forest to agricultural land, you get rid of biodiversity, whatever you do with that agricultural land. If you plough a field, you affect biodiversity. So it's not just whether you apply a GMO or a pesticide. Agriculture itself changes the landscape and changes the biodiversity of the landscape. And you can't get away from that. And we might as well recognise that. But there are different ways of controlling weeds and pests. Yes, we can put lots of people in the field to pick them up by hand. And unfortunately, in many developing countries, that's what they have to do. But the standard of living of those people is not that high, not that great. Do they want to pick weeds out by hand or not? We can make that decision. That's a societal decision. But we shouldn't forget that if we want to grow food, we want agriculture, you will change biodiversity.
One for the panel discussion, I think. Very quickly, please.
Nick Birch from the James Hutton Institute and the EFSA GMO panel. I think I picked up in your presentation, you said that EFSA deal with local and short-term effects. I would disagree with that.
No, I didn't say EFSA did. I said that the specific protection goals that EFSA developed in that opinion for plant protection products allowed local short-term effects.
Okay.
Because it allows a recovery. There's two options, a threshold option and a recovery option.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe I wasn't clear, I apologise.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.